Brian, over to you.
So, coming last, quite a lot of what has been said about infrastructure is going to be incorporated in what I say. On the other hand, I suspect there may be some different slants, I hope there are some different slants from what you've heard already. And the title of our consortium, International, first of all, International Centre for Infrastructure Futures. We're looking more at the national and international scene perhaps than Richard has been, and we're looking a little bit further out in terms of futures. What is interesting, of course, those of you who know about EPSRC Research Council processes, that's the first time I've heard what Richard's doing. This will be the first time he's heard what I'm doing, or our consortium is doing. Sorry, that was to be more exact. So part of course, the thesis is that we'll be working together. But this is the first time we've discovered how that might actually work, which of course in infrastructural terms is quite interesting in itself. So what are we about? Well, the first thing we're about is doing something different from how things have been done in the past. We've actually inherited that attitude to risk assessment from the Victorian era. Well, let's just do it. That's how the Victorians did a lot of the infrastructure that is around us, up until probably the mid-1960s, because after the Second World War, we actually just did it anyway because it needed repairing. Since then, we've become more and more risk-averse, less and less innovative, and more cautious. And therefore, what we have is an inheritance of Victorian infrastructure, which is rapidly becoming unfit for purpose. So part of the thesis is we need to think about risk assessment and benefit realization from a rather different viewpoint from how we have been doing it in this country for the last 150 years. I emphasize in this country because part of our thesis, of course, is to look at internationally to see how risk analysis and benefit realization has been carried out in other countries where they haven't had the legacy of the 150 years that we've got. Second thing to talk about is that we are adopting, as Richard is, a very broad base of value propositions in the way we assess infrastructural services. And what this is designed to show you is a set of words which most of you, if you read those words as they get smaller and smaller, will recognize, yeah, they're all part of what we have to consider. And what we're about is making sure that on any given instance, one or other of them might be more important than another, but that none of them ever become dominant in the way that, certainly over the last 40 years, some of the factors in the way in which assessments have been done have become dominant. And so what we're after is seeing how can we develop a framework for assessment of infrastructure from birth to death, which values things in a more holistic way than has been done in the past. But that's where we start from. We start from a situation where we have aging infrastructure and most of it is buried, and its state, as you heard from Robert Mair earlier, is relatively unknown. So we actually don't know very much about where we're starting from in general terms. Of course, there are specifics that all of you could point to where we know more or less. But nevertheless, we have an aging infrastructure that is very poorly understood. And society is now beginning to realize, especially young society, which is why that picture's there, and one or two of you will recognize one or two people in that picture, are actually becoming quite worried about it, because actually this isn't about 60% of the people in this room. The 40% who are much younger than me are the people we are concerned about, because it's their infrastructure, their developed world that we're actually talking about. Infrastructure, as we're talking about it here today, is a characteristic of a developed country. And if we don't look after it, we won't be a developed country. So that is part of what we're about. And so for those young people in that picture, this is rather important. Interdependence is a word that's been used quite a lot. This is actually a simplified diagram taken from an analysis of Hurricane Katrina, showing the sorts of interdependency that caused some of the chaos that occurred after that hurricane hit. And although this is a simplified diagram, as you can see, it's still pretty complex, and it covers quite a wide range of not only infrastructure, but infrastructure services. In other words, those social functions that are derived from the use of infrastructure. And the reason I put that on there is what we're interested in is a much richer set of entities with which there is interdependence. So we're interested in the politics, we're interested in the regulation, in the legal aspects, in the accounting aspects, as well as the systems engineering, the innovation and the technology and the processes and the finance. There's lots of things which are interrelated, have interdependencies, decisions taken in one domain have either profitable or perverse outcomes in another domain, and we need to understand those preferably in advance and not as a result of catastrophic failure because someone turns a valve off because that's what the legality said, which sort of happened in Australia not very long ago. Too many people put up pictures of floods already. I needn't really say any more. It is probably the hot item in this country. It is in one or two other countries, but it's not the only catastrophic issue that worries people. So we do have to worry about extreme events of one sort or another. Those of you who like gleaming new buildings might be a bit envious of this. This is the Infrastructure Research Facility in Australia. They've been given a 60 million Australian dollar grant to build a facility at Wollongong University. I was there 2 weeks ago to do infrastructure research for Australia. I was actually saying to colleagues earlier, if you did a Wordle count of the use of the word infrastructure in the sense that we're using it here today, 10 years ago in this country, you probably wouldn't have found many newspapers or professional journals talking about infrastructure. They'd have talked about transport, they'd have talked about energy, they'd talked about water, but they wouldn't have talked about infrastructure. Unlike Australia, where every daily paper has infrastructure on its front page almost every day, because it's critical to their survival. For some reason, we don't see it as critical to survival, and yet it is, because it is 150 years old and we've sort of forgotten about it. This is part of the international bit of ICIF. We already have collaboration with Wollongong University, where this is. It's about 50 miles south of Sydney, and they are building relationships with most of the big 10 universities in Australia, and that's why I was there, came back last week. So that's the sort of landscape in which ICIF is working. The consortium that we're working with is the Engineering Science faculty at UCL, and the Built Environment and Planning faculty, commonly known as the Bartlett, Bristol University Systems Centre, Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex, Renewable Energy at Southampton, and the Intelligent Agents Multimedia Group at Southampton, and the Water Science Institute in Cranfield. So you can see it's quite a rich consortium of players in academia. I've not put up the 22 industrial players who we are collaborating with, and I actually don't have the picture of all the neat logos either, so apologies for that. But we do have a very large industrial linkage into a very wide range of not only builders of infrastructure, but also operators of infrastructure. Because the business model that we are going to be talking about goes from the business model at conception through to the business model at decommissioning, and all the business models you might need all the way down the line, and it's not clear to us ab initio that the same business model is appropriate for all of the various stages. Indeed, we're pretty sure it isn't, and it will differ for different sectors in different ways. So the vision, everyone has a vision, is this. Major improvement, first of all. This isn't about incremental changes, this is about a major improvement, and hence is going to be medium to long term rather than short term. In policy making, and how is policy made around infrastructure? At the moment, it's made largely in silos, forgiving colleagues from IUK who are in the room, in government, either locally or nationally, and hence the commercialisation of that tends to be focused around projects and schemes which are sectoral. What we're adopting, therefore, is a multidisciplinary approach to a phrase that Richard used. We're going to use exactly the same phrase, value capture, and the generation of new business models. And models is important because of these various stages that we see as being necessary. So what this is about is taking policy through to commercialisation. It's looking at all the infrastructural components together, not in isolation from each other, using a multidisciplinary approach to how valuable it might be. And the value, you remember the second picture I put up of all the words that describe where the value might come from. All of them will be part of the value capture process. And hence we will need to generate a completely new way of thinking about how we develop investments in that value capture process. And the investment is not only financial investment, it's environmental investment, it's sociological investment, it's expertise investment, and not least, political investment. Because without understanding how the political investment is going to play out, especially in a 5-year cycle of a democracy, which is difficult, is a very important part of what we've got to try and achieve. And what we've done, I think, in the last 3 or 4 decades is duck the issue of how that 5-year political cycle gets in the way of delivering long-term investment. So what we're determined to do is to face up to that and see what we can do within that constraint. That's why international is important too, because almost all other countries, not all, but almost all, have a similar problem. I was also in New Zealand on this same trip to the other side of the planet, and they have a 3-year cycle. So if you think we're badly off, go to Auckland. They have a really bad problem. So the vision will also therefore develop the use of a systems thinking rationale. And that is going to apply to all relevant aspects of infrastructure provision, but in particular, the interdependencies issue. And that's interdependencies not just in terms of the systems, the technological systems or the engineering systems, but also the political systems, the regulatory systems, the financial systems, insurance systems. All of them interact with each other and across all of those various domains. And importantly, what's the use of data? Now, I could spend a whole talk talking about the data bit and how you derive and infer information and execute decisions on the back of the data that comes out of infrastructure, either partially or as Robert displayed earlier, more completely in the future. But that data is absolutely crucial to making any form of policy or execution decision. What we also want to do is accelerate the rate at which some of these things are taken on board. So one of the important things is that we understand how to learn from our discoveries and embed that learning in not only in academia, but also in government and in commerce through the various networks that we've got within the project and we will be building as we go forward. So the whole learning process is embedded in what we do. It's a critical factor in what we are aiming to achieve. And it's building on a significant amount of academic work that's been done at Bristol in how to develop an embedded learning environment, both in physical terms, but importantly in virtual terms, so that we can propagate this out through the commercial activity, through supply chains, but also into governments at a range of different scales. And then integrating all of that between disciplines, across institutions, but using novel structured methods of working. So we're looking to see how we can exploit ICT to a much better extent than we have in the past in this sort of domain. So that's sort of where we're starting from. That's the grand plan. As Richard indicated, it's the plan because we're starting. Unfortunately, we haven't got very far down the road yet. So the major thrust at the moment is what makes up a business model. An holistic view of what do we mean by the word business model, because one of the things, of course, we've discovered, it's a multidisciplinary program. You say this to different people, everyone has their own worldview of what a business model is. And since that's rather important, we're spending a little bit of time to make sure we all agree on what a business model either could mean or does mean as we go forward, because without that, we're likely to argue rather than take any matter forward. Second thing, which is important, is nothing is sacrosanct. So we're including regulation, legislation, governance, financing as areas to dig up and see whether they're useful in the way they are for the future. And if they're not, why not? And what can we do to move from where we are to where we need to be to make them more useful? So the phrase is coming, legacies everywhere, we're surrounded by it. History is important and predicts nothing. Because actually the world is changing. There are so many factors, externalities to infrastructure that are changing, whether it's democracy, overall population, climate change, attitudes, politics, that actually taking an incremental approach from our past may not be entirely appropriate in the medium to long term. It may well be in the shorter term. We're treating now research as a wicked problem, and hence the idea that this is a project with a well-defined start, middle and end is not necessarily appropriate. We're not going to throw it out with willy-nilly, but we're looking at the whole wicked problem literature to see how we deal with complexity head-on. And indeed, we have one of the major complexity analysis groups at Cranfield involved in this project. So that means we deal with complexity as it appears, and therefore we don't oversimplify just for the sake of doing something, because it's all too often quite apparent that decisions are made for various reasons in the short term so that something can happen and something can be said to be happening regardless of whether it's even useful or meaningful. And we're trying to contest that on the basis of evidence and analysis. We're going to deal interdependency explicitly and put it up front, as with data. And we're going to, you love this, what's the purpose of having infrastructure? Why have we got it? What sort of services are we deriving from it? Should we have it in the way that it is currently architected? The obvious one at the moment is distributed electrical energy generation. Why do we have mammoth power stations? Well, because we've always had mammoth power stations. In the future, with the technologies we've got and the constraints we're having, is that the right solution? I'm not saying it isn't, but we need to dig up some of those things and just see if we could live differently in a more sustainable way, a more environmentally, politically, economically acceptable way by examining those things. Because if academics don't do this, the market certainly won't. And governments won't have the bravery to do that either. So the characteristics of success, like resilience, cost of ownership, decommissioning, aesthetics, are all important factors in delivering livability, quality of life, not only in cities, but in rural areas as well. So in our short 3-year program, we're sort of examining the purpose of life and world peace, as sort of was indicated earlier. No, seriously, we are attempting to take a fairly big picture view of how infrastructure plays out in a developed society, because part of what we therefore will have is scenarios, possible scenarios for futures. Do you want a really environmentally friendly world? Do you want one that is really gung-ho in terms of its economics? Do you want something that is totally crime-free and quite totalitarian? Or what? Because all of those things are up for grabs, and I'm only use those as illustrative examples. So that's what we're about. And of course, we therefore want to do international comparisons, because we're not alone in facing this problem. Most other developed societies in Europe in particular, of the old European world, are in different stages of evolution in this space. They all have different histories, they all have different anthropologies, they all have different legal, commercial structures. So you can't just lift the lessons in and go for it, because it doesn't work. We've already tried that. So we've actually got to examine it at a greater level of detail to find out what works and what doesn't. Lastly, an advert. In October, in Australia, there is an international symposium on next generation infrastructure. It's the first one of 4, and there's a call for papers out for anyone who feels they can go to the other side of the planet and deliver a paper on what their view is about next generation infrastructure. So if anywhere in academia you've got postdocs or lecturers or researchers who have something to say about this subject, and say it in October. It's the first of a series, but this one happens to be in Australia. The one next year will be in Europe. Please take note of that web address, which you will also find. You've only got to remember ISNGI. It's the first hit on Google, I'm delighted to tell you. And we'd be delighted to be able to see you there. It's possible that some accommodation on resources for travel support might be available, I was told to say. So might be available. So thank you for that, and that's all I wanted to say about where ICIF is going. Thank you very much.